Good afternoon, Marine. Give me your name and where you're from.
My name's Dan Cooper, and currently I live in Anchorage, Alaska. Back in May of 1965, I was attending college at the University of Central Washington in Ellensburg, and I was flunking out. So I decided I'd better join the Marine Corps to avoid the draft, which I did, being a draft dodger by nature. Right out of ITR, I got assigned to MASS-3 at El Toro in September, October of 1965. And so I went there as a 2531, a field radio operator, untrained, no school. The only schooling I got from the Marine Corps was to get my military driver's license, which I immediately abused by wrecking a Jeep. And then they sent me to Vietnamese language school at the Wing G2. So I had a 12-week intensive language course in Vietnamese. When MASS-3 first got its orders to leave El Toro and head to Vietnam, I had just received orders to go to the language school at Monterey in Chinese, but Major Dixon called me into his office and asked if I wouldn't stay with the unit and go to Vietnam because I was the only one they had trained. So I said, sure. Went to, I moved with the unit via the USS Jennings County from San Diego, the great false start. We start off one day, the stacks catch on fire, we have to turn around and come back to port. They had to do some repairs so we could actually leave. You know, the great stop at Pearl Harbor for 10 days with all but 2 days of shore leave. I was 19 at the time and couldn't drink, so the only place I could drink was Fort DeRussy. It became my new home, away from home. As we sailed across the Pacific, independently steaming, we ran into a typhoon, and some of the others might remember this that went over on the Jennings County, but every hour they were going down and battening down the bow doors, and when they sprung some leaks here and there were all kinds of problems. So they decided to stop at Okinawa, drop off an advance team, and then steam to the Philippines, Subic Bay, to do the rest of the repairs. So I got off with the advance party. We drove from Naha up to Kadena. We're there for a few days. We're lifted in by a C-130 into Chulai and got there several weeks before the rest of the unit got there with the LST. When the advance party got there, there was nothing but 2 hills with a valley and a seep running down the middle at Chulai. The Seabees showed up after a couple of weeks, and in about 10 days they terraced those hills, built the parade ground, the grinder, they built all of the administration huts, they built the big warehouse for the supply people, and then they built up the hill that had all of our Southeast Asia huts, including a hut that became a recreation hut and a kitchen and dining hall. Now, I didn't know that MASS-3 had cooks, but we had cooks show up and we had hot meals that were cooked by Marine cooks there at Chulai, and at least in the early days. We were right across the main supply route, the MSR, from FLSG Bravo at the time. Mass Deuce, I think, had an ASRAT there on the top of the hill, and our team took that over when they all got in. So that was our CP for MASS-3 in the early years. As a field radio operator, I basically went out whenever we had a detachment that went out into the field to set up what we were calling at that time a mini DASC. You know, we set one up in Quang Ngai, Duc Pho. We had a couple of battalion-sized, regiment-sized operations south of Chulai. We'd set up mini DASCs, and I'd go out with those and set up the radios for them. In June of 1967, we finally got our area of responsibility for doing civic action, and I was then the civic action NCO and spent the next 6 months out in the village working with the Vietnamese. Primarily our efforts were medical civic action patrols, taking our corpsmen. We had 2 corpsmen assigned to MASS-3 at that time, 2 docs. Take them out with a small security detail, which was mainly people like Howard Gunderson and Paul Cale and Will Brown and Bruce Meacham, you know, just guys with M14s. And, you know, we'd kind of wander around and hand out candy and so forth. But the docs would treat the children primarily, but also the adults. mostly impetigo and infectious diseases, but every now and then some really serious kind of stuff. Another area of effort was in improving the drinking water, the potability of the drinking water for the Vietnamese. Serendipitously, it turns out that if you can stop diarrhea in infants, you can really decrease the infant mortality rate. So we started building aprons around the wells. We also built a little 2-room clinic for the Vietnamese nurse who worked in that village. I went back in 2009. One of the wells is still there. You wouldn't drink from it now because they've moved a bicycle repair shop almost right on top of it, and there's all kinds of solvents and POL on the ground around it. The little 2-room clinic is now part of a private residence, but you can still find all the old roads and places that were there. The Buddhist temple that was on kind of the north side of the main street in Tam Key is gone, but the little schoolhouse compound where I taught English as a Civic Action NCO is still there and still being used as a school. So some of those effects are still there. I think that if you'll recall, this was McNamara's war, and so everything was done by numbers. And if you go back and read the daily reports starting in June of '67, you'll see that we had to report how many people we treated, how many people we taught English, how many bags of cement I stole. Now, that one didn't get in. But Lieutenant Bill McEwen gave me a 4.5 on my fitness report because I didn't steal enough cement for him, and I told him later that just killed my career in the Marine Corps. I just couldn't go forward, so I had to get out. We had a club. We had a couple of clubs. Somebody got the great idea that we would build a little amphitheater with a screen behind it to show movies, and then USO troops could come, and they did, and we had entertainment. But when you were out in the field, for instance, the deployment to Quezon in January of '68, I went on that deployment. I was up there for several weeks. I went in with the DASC, flew in on a CH-53, flew out on a CH-46. Paul Kale found me walking down the road, headed towards Hill 327, and picked me up and gave me a ride back. It was living in holes, living in trenches. I got in trouble with Colonel Lowndes, the commanding officer of the 26th Marines, for not wearing my helmet and flak jacket when I was in the bottom of the trench digging it deeper, but I survived that without a mast. So I kept on going, left Vietnam with MASS-3 in the late spring, early summer of 1968. So 65 to 68, had the same M14 the entire time, although I did add a selector switch, courtesy of a supply guy for a bottle of whiskey. When I returned, I wound up at 29 Palms, and then I got out of the Corps. Went on to get a degree in business administration, became a certified public accountant in Washington State and Alaska. My older son then came down with childhood cancer, so we moved back to Washington State, and I worked days, went to law school nights, and got a law degree. Since then, he's recovered. He's a lawyer. His little brother is a professor of English in the Midwest. I retired after a career as a certified public accountant, state prosecutor, and federal prosecutor, and now I don't do anything but answer questions.
Well, thank you. We're glad that your son did come forward and is with us today. And thank you, Maureen.
Thank you.